It's good to be with you today, Jan. You do important work.
Well, I appreciate that, and it really has been way too long since we spoke last. I believe it's actually been 4 years since you've been on the show. You were actually one of the earlier guests on the show when American Thought Leaders first began back in 2019. And one of the things we talked about is your area of expertise, which is some of the demographic realities around China and Chinese Communist Party policy. So we're going to talk about that today. But let's talk about how this intersects with the current, harsh realities of the real estate market. Let's start there.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party's real estate sector is in the process of collapsing right now. And its collapse, of course, has taken longer than some of us thought. But when it happens, and it's beginning to happen now, it will take place much more quickly than anyone anticipated. The real estate sector, the property sector of the Chinese economy is about 60% of the economy. It's where much of the wealth of the Chinese people is invested. And that wealth is going to disappear overnight. But what I really would like to start with, Jan, is how this works on the local level. Because, I was in China back in 1979, 1980. I was the first American social scientist allowed on the ground in China to actually live and work among the villagers in China who were then living in people's communes. They were dissolved the year after I left. I've been back many times since, but my affection, my love for the Chinese people, especially for people living in the countryside, has never waned. I've always been fighting for them, and of course they are the chief victims of the Chinese Communist Party. Everyone in China, of course, aside from Communist Party members, is a victim of the Chinese Communist Party. But the people in the cities have been treated a lot better than the people in the countryside. And here's what happens in the countryside on the property side of the equation. You will have local officials coming in from the township or coming in from the county level government or even the next level up, which is the prefectural level, and saying, we're going to raise this village to the ground and we're going to build an apartment complex on the ground where it stood. Now, they will give the local villagers little or nothing in compensation for destroying their houses and taking their land. That's why we frequently see riots in China that are put down by the Communist Party's riot police as people object, quite rightly, to having their homes destroyed. The deal is, it works this way. It's really a scam on the part of these local communist officials. They will go to a local builder and a local bank and say, we have this plot of land. They won't say they stole it from the peasants, but they did. We have this plot of land, and we would like the construction company to build a high-rise apartment building on it, and we would like you, the local People's Bank, to loan us the money to do that. And they all meet, in a back room somewhere and work out how to split the cash that results. And the expectation is these poor villagers who've had their homes destroyed will have no choice but to buy apartments to live in, because otherwise they would be homeless. So who benefits from this? Well, the local officials at the bank and the construction company and the local communist officials, who are all on the take. Who suffers from this? The villagers, who suffer twice. Not only do they have their homes destroyed, but they then are virtually forced by local officials to buy into this apartment complex and further enrich the communist corrupt officials. So that's how the property scam works on the local level, and you can magnify that to the prefectural level, to the provincial level, to the national level, and you can see how companies like Evergrande got to be the size that they are today. And you can see how this is kind of a giant Ponzi scheme, because once you overbuild to a certain extent, and China has overbuilt now, they've got 70 or 80 million empty apartment buildings, 70 or 80 million empty apartment buildings, a stock that would take a generation to sell down, even if they built nothing new, and too few people to buy those apartment buildings. And so the economy, this giant Ponzi scheme, which is built on this kind of real estate development, is in the middle of collapsing before our very eyes. Now, that's why Evergrande has begun to declare bankruptcy and can no longer issue bonds, because no one will buy their junk bonds to build apartment buildings that no one will ever occupy. Would hesitate for a minute to do that. So before the end of the day, before the end of the century, maybe before the end of this decade, I think we will see forced pregnancy in one form or another in China today. It's a logical outcome of the situation that they're in.
Absolutely fascinating, Steve. Quick final thought as we finish.
Well, I think, as always, we have to keep in our hearts and minds the suffering of the Chinese people at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, who are the first and foremost victims of the Chinese Communist Party. We also have to realize that we should never, under any circumstances, however dangerous they may seem, learn any lessons, take any advice from the Chinese Communist Party, which has effectively been in a Cold War with the United States from the founding of the People's Republic of China.
Well, Steve Mosher, it's such a pleasure.
In Russia's predominantly Muslim Dagestan region on Sunday. NTD's Daniel Monahan has more on the incident, which resulted in at least 60 arrests and the injury of 9 police officers.
The riot was sparked by reports of a plane from Israel arriving at the airport. The flight from Tel Aviv was quickly surrounded by an angry mob upon landing. On the tarmac, some rioters reportedly tried breaking into the plane. Here, a suspect is surrounded by the mob. His alleged crime? Being Jewish. He says he's from Uzbekistan, but they don't believe him. They say he must wait until they make a decision on whether he is free to go. One mob member yells to get his phone. Here, the enraged mob storms into the terminal building, carrying Palestinian flags, screaming Allahu Akbar. The halls are soon flooded as cries of God is the greatest continue. The enraged mob searches for Jewish people. They begin pulling doors open, frantic in their search. A woman seems to tell them that what they're looking for is not behind her door. Outside, the frenzied mob tries to flip over a police car. Here, a crowd gathers outside a hotel after a Jewish man checked into it, reportedly shouting, "Show your face, or we will come into the hotel and pull you out of there." Security forces closed the airport and removed the rioters. 20 people were injured during the riot before Makhachkala Airport was back under control. Security forces say the passengers on the plane were safe. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
In Russia's predominantly Muslim Dagestan region on Sunday. NTD's Daniel Monahan has more on the incident, which resulted in at least 60 arrests and the injury of 9 police officers.
The riot was sparked by reports of a plane from Israel arriving at the airport. The flight from Tel Aviv was quickly surrounded by an angry mob upon landing. On the tarmac, some rioters reportedly tried breaking into the plane. Here, a suspect is surrounded by the mob. His alleged crime? Being Jewish. He says he's from Uzbekistan, but they don't believe him. They say he must wait until they make a decision on whether he is free to go. One mob member yells to get his phone. Here, the enraged mob storms into the terminal building, carrying Palestinian flags, screaming Allahu Akbar. The halls are soon flooded as cries of God is the greatest continue. The enraged mob searches for Jewish people. They begin pulling doors open, frantic in their search. A woman seems to tell them that what they're looking for is not behind her door. Outside, the frenzied mob tries to flip over a police car. Here, a crowd gathers outside a hotel after a Jewish man checked into it, reportedly shouting, "Show your face, or we will come into the hotel and pull you out of there." Security forces closed the airport and removed the rioters. 20 people were injured during the riot before Makhachkala Airport was back under control. Security forces say the passengers on the plane were safe. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
Not a plan in Taiwan.
Neither Russia nor China have condemned Hamas's terrorist attack. The two exercised their veto power in the UN Security Council to block a U.S. effort to support Israel last week. China has put pressure on Israel to stop bombing Gaza. Mixed signals toward the West coming out of a Monday security forum in Beijing. China's second most senior military commander says he aims to boost defense ties with Washington, while Moscow said it was open to discussing security issues. That's as Beijing-Moscow relations grow ever friendlier. But the Chinese and Russian military chiefs also heaped criticism onto the U.S.
Certain countries keep stirring up troubles around the world. They deliberately create turbulences, meddle in regional affairs, interfere in other countries' internal affairs, and instigate color revolution.
Russia's defense minister blamed the West for getting involved in its war on Ukraine and warned of conflict between global superpowers. While the top Chinese official noted that Beijing's military wouldn't tolerate Western support for Taiwanese independence. The Chinese Communist Party claims the island as its territory, though it has never ruled Taiwan. China and the U.S. have had no high-level military communication since August 2022. Beijing suspended talks after then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. The radio silence has sparked fear over a potential clash in the South China Sea. Former Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is dead. Details of his passing faced immediate censorship inside China, but Chinese people around the world still found ways to commemorate him. Here's what one citizen from Li's hometown had to say. Watch.
They're expressing their wishes by mourning him in this way because under the current circumstances, people may be too depressed and have many disappointments. They're hugely disappointed.
Li's passing last Friday garnered huge public attention. On Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, the hashtag about his death exceeded 1 billion views in just a few hours. But Beijing's censorship engine appeared to step in quickly. Now almost all comments on the topic have been removed from social media. Even his name, Li Keqiang, has been blocked. The South China Morning Post reported that a student counselor at a university in Beijing said he didn't want students to organize memorials because it could lead to an event similar to what happened in 1989. At the time, following the death of former Chinese Communist Party leader Hu Yaobang, thousands of students gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn. The demonstration triggered a nationwide pro-democracy movement that lasted for 2 months. It ended in a massacre, with the Chinese military opening fire on unarmed students and citizens. Former leader Hu Yaobang has been considered more open-minded to reforms than others. Similarly, Li Keqiang is being remembered for his promise that China would remain open to the rest of the world. Memorial activities were held for him in at least 2 areas over the weekend: Hefei City, Li's hometown, and Zhengzhou City, where he worked. The line of people waiting to pay respects stretched for more than half a mile. A billboard bearing Li's image was also set up. China Affairs analyst Tang Jingyuan said people are seeking an outlet for their resentment toward current Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and that Li's passing is giving them an opportunity.
These memorials are not because of how great and good Li Keqiang was, but because everyone thinks Xi Jinping is bad.
Tang described Li's tenure as premier as mediocre because Xi Jinping had the final say on matters of state. Tang went on to say that many Chinese people see themselves in similar situation.
Under the iron fist of the CCP, represented by Xi Jinping, they are beaten to the ground and almost powerless to fight back. They implicitly regard Li Keqiang as one of them, suffering the same fate. It's an outpouring of empathy.
Tang believes they must be held directly and demand political change. But now people mainly complain about economic losses.
For the first time, the U.S. has started buying Japanese seafood to supply its military in the country. That's in a bid to offset China's import ban on the country's seafood. Beijing imposed it after Japan released treated wastewater from its Fukushima plant in August. In announcing the initiative, U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, said it would begin with purchases of scallops before expanding to all types of Japanese seafood.
China will continue its economic coercion. But the best way we have proven in all the instances to kind of wear out China's economic coercion is come to the aid and assistance of the targeted country or industry. So this is one step.
Emmanuel said the purchases would feed soldiers and be sold in shops and restaurants on military bases. He said the U.S. military had not previously purchased local seafood in Japan. Beijing was once the biggest buyer of Japanese seafood globally. The regime says its import ban is due to food safety fears. The UN nuclear watchdog has vouched for the safety of Japan's water release. Next, a special segment shines a light on the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration into one democratic country, with Communist China to its west and a shared border with Communist North Korea. Democratic values and the way of life South Koreans enjoy are facing an imminent challenge. An American performing arts tour from taking the stage. What's the tour about, and why is the Chinese Communist Party pushing back on it in Korea? NTD dives into the history of the Chinese regime's interference with Xinjiang and why the free world needs to know. The long arm of Chinese censorship reaching a key U.S. ally, South Korea. Major theaters in Seoul now declining to rent their venues to Xinjiang, an American performing arts company whose dance and music portray China before communism. Epoch Times investigations show that a Chinese embassy in Korea has for years been threatening Korean theaters with economic and political retaliation if they let Xinjiang perform. In 2016, KBS Hall, owned by Korea's national broadcaster, canceled a contract with Xinjiang after the Chinese embassy sent them a letter warning it will be detrimental to the relationship between Korea and China if the theater proceeded with Xinjiang performances. A Korean court ruling in this case explicitly pointed to potential economic retaliation from Beijing, stating that if KBS cannot export its broadcasting contents to China, it may face huge losses. But Korea is not the only democratic country in which the CCP is using its political and economic leverage to censor free art. Chinese embassies have sent similar letters trying to stop Xinjiang from performing to theaters and elected officials in the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia. In one case in Spain, the Chinese ambassador there admitted on tape that he personally warned a Madrid theater that they would lose the Chinese market if they didn't cancel Xinjiang.
跟中国的这个市场今后合作的前景是非常广阔的。你不能因为这个东西呢就丢掉了这个中国市场。他们也是马上就是认识到这个问题。
But why would a powerful regime use all kinds of tactics to interfere with a classical Chinese dance show? Xinjiang describes its mission as to revive China's 5 millennia-old traditional culture, which has been largely destroyed under decades of communist rule. The group's performers also practice Falun Gong, a meditation practice whose practitioners are persecuted by the Chinese regime. Some company members have fled religious persecution themselves or have family members still imprisoned in China. Alongside dances portraying scenes from imperial dynasties and literary classics, some of the show's pieces also depict the story of what Falun Gong practitioners are facing in China today, or attacks on Buddhist temples during the Cultural Revolution. The show's perspectives on Chinese culture, history, and spirituality have put it on the CCP's target list. But it's also these values that have drawn millions of audience members from around the world. Xinjiang now tours in nearly 200 cities and 20 countries every year. While the CCP's campaigns to censor the show have failed in most countries, they are making headway in Korea. How Korea and the US act on it could decide if China can exert control over more key allies, all at a crossroads, bowing to CCP pressure or upholding values shared by the free world.
Sabotaging the buses that the Xinjiang performers travel in to the theaters, slashing the tires, a variety of things, even pressuring theaters throughout the world to not invite Xinjiang and not host them. Why are we seeing this type of resistance from the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, here's some main reason. CCP starts the persecution against Falun Gong in China in 1999. CCP is afraid of exposure of their persecution in China, and so that's why they try to interfere as much as they can.
Do you have any evidence that the CCP is behind this and some of the actions that they've taken?
Yeah, we have many evidence. CCP uses all kinds of methods to interfere with the Xinjiang performance in South Korea. And then one of the examples is they send official letter to the theater or city government to pressure them to cancel the show or cancel the contract.
And so pressure is one thing, but following through on that pressure is another. Can you tell us about the instances where the Korean theater in Korea has canceled a Shenyun performance?
There's many cases canceling show in South Korea, and one of the standout is the KBS case in 2016. We had almost sold out show. They sent us notice to cancel the venue rental contract. And then we take that appeal to the court, and then the court cited our appeal. After that, KBS submit their appeal again with the official letter from the Chinese embassy, so we can. That's on evidence. And earlier this year, there was a media report about this issue. They had an interview with a Chinese embassy person, and then they clearly mentioned to the reporter that they're going to intervene with activities for Falun Dafa and Shenyun.
Foreign investment into China is declining. According to the Financial Times, foreign investment in China fell by 1/3 in September compared to the previous year, the largest drop in nearly a decade. Foreign investment into China has seen double-digit percentage drops every month since May. Some analysts say that foreign companies are trying to get their profits out of the country as fast as they can, and that seems to be a trend. According to China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange, more money left the country in September than came in. Net outflow reached nearly $54 billion, marking the highest outflow since January 2016. The U.S. in recent months has moved to restrict American investment in mainland China. At the same time, Beijing's revision of its anti-espionage law in July may have also contributed. That's over concerns of arbitrary detention, raids on foreign businesses inside China, and the law's vague description of what could be seen as espionage. Chinese property giant Evergrande getting one last chance. On Monday, a critical hearing for the company was adjourned until December 4th. A Hong Kong judge ruled this was the company's final opportunity to come up with a restructuring plan. If it fails, Evergrande will likely face liquidation. Here's more.
So many people who are pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian, and Waleed, even a city council in a city in California denouncing Israel, saying that Israel is committing ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to overwhelm your viewers, but you and I had so many discussions. I mean, we're witnesses to history. We're talking about 18 years of, engaging and watching what was happening, in terms of the morphing of jihadi organizations. Now, let's look at 2 points to answer your complex question. Number one, yes, the Iran regime is the mothership of at least one large branch of these terrorists. You have 2 branches, one which comes from the Sunni environment, but is extreme and actually against the Sunni moderates. That's the Muslim Brotherhood, Daesh, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. And the other one that we're dealing with now is the one influenced by Shia radicals who are in control of Iran. But here's what is unique about Hamas. Number one, it is made of members who are Sunni. But number two, it is funded by a Shia radical organization network that is controlled by Iran. So this is the ultimate, I would almost call it by terrorists. It's like bipartisan here. They have by terrorists. Imagine when Al-Qaeda and ISIS and then Hezbollah on the other side merge into something new. That's what we're dealing with. You raised a question that is way more important than any discussion till now, since the operation, which is what is happening here at home. I mean, our public, some reactions of some circles within our, the American people, raises questions. Why would it be that thousands of citizens, U.S. citizens, we're assuming, and maybe residents, have been adopting the lexicon of Hamas? I mean, in the past, those who were anti-Israel, we understand there are people who are pro-Israel and people who are anti-Israel. But what we see right now is that we have seen out of these campuses in an entire generation that considers Israel as illegitimate. But not just that, but the actions of the jihadists in Israel are legitimate. And it's also true not just for Israel, but for the Kurds and for the Arab Sunni moderates, for the Christian minorities. So there is a systemic problem which I try to explain when we engage in the discussion, and you just saw it clearly. There is a problem in our campuses, and that problem is the fact that there is an elite which since the end of the 90s has been providing, I would call it now clearly, disinformation and misinformation and radicalization of an entire generation, more or less. Now, the more dangerous question, and I can discuss it with you as well, where is it coming from? Where does the origin or the funding for these new Middle East studies or radical Middle East studies coming from? Now the public can understand that when we send money to Iran, when we send those billions of dollars, what do you think the Iran regime do with this money? Well, they earmark it for weapons, for militias, but one slice comes back as donations from foundations and NGOs, and with it comes the message. So the Iranian regime was involved in the radicalization that is leading, and that led to what we have seen now on the streets and on campuses.
What can the United States, its Western allies, its allies within the Israeli community, what can they do to stop this type of disastrous situation?
Well, Kelly, first let's try to take a look at the Iran plan, meaning the regime. When I say Iran, I mean definitely the regime. The plan was, number one, first goal, to stop what was going to happen, which was a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel to seal the deal of the Abraham Accords.
Absolutely.
And that would have isolated the regime. That would have done tremendous things in the region and, of course, worldwide. So over a couple of years, especially since the withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan, that's another factor. It encouraged them. It put them in a position of they are on steroids now. So they prepared Hamas, they prepared Hezbollah in the north of Israel for an operation that would at least delay, paralyze, or break down the Israeli-Saudi rapprochement. That's by itself already would be a catastrophe if it happens. But there is a second reason, which is internal to Iran. The revolution that I mentioned to you, which we have witnessed for many, many months, by young people, by women, by minorities inside Iran, was very close from actually changing the direction of the country, changing that regime, and starting a new Iran, which would have ended Hezbollah, ended Hamas, ended all of these radicals. The regime, Khamenei and the Pasdaran and the Quds Force who control Iran, they feared that the international community in the United States, maybe not this administration, but another administration or Congress, would fund and support the revolution. So to redirect attention, I call it the mega decoy. Decoy is when you try to divert attention. And that diversion of attention was in the form of a huge terror attack against Israel. And the real goal, is once Hamas, strikes with that barbarity, Israel cannot but counterstrike. And when Israel counterstrike, that's what they wanted. So they provoked it to be hit by the Israelis and then run around with their troops around the world and mobilize, as you just mentioned, and say, oh, they're killing our civilians. But the first chapter of that play was done precisely to bring Israel into war and to break all kind of relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, between Israel and Europe, the clash between this administration and Israel. They have very, very smart, intelligent strategists, I can tell you that.
Yeah, let's not forget that they created the game of chess, and they have applied it in a very brutal way in this current climate that we're living in. I'm talking to terrorism expert Walid Ferreras. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more of Walid in just a moment. So, Walid, that's a very sobering thought about what's happening along our southern border. And certainly it's been that way for many years, especially since this new administration came into play. The former president of the United States, Donald Trump,
was actually making sure that he could stop the threat by strengthening the southern border. The current president, Joe Biden, has actually allowed so many people to come across, and of course we hear about gotaways. Do we understand how severe this threat is, not only to Israel, but to the free world?
That's another drama on a historical level, because I observed the last decade and a half. When you speak with national security experts or analysts, as you know, also I've briefed many agencies for many, many years on all sorts of levels, especially counterterrorism, but also special operations and radicalization. So the bottom line is this. We witnessed a change of policy between 2009 and 2017. These are the 2 terms of President Obama. And during those 2 terms, that's almost a decade, 8 years, many things have been changed in the national security doctrine of the United States, which in fact reconstructed our doctrine by priorities that had nothing to do with Iran. Actually, with Iran, the national security doctrine was about to partner with them, find common ground, which is the Iran deal. And the Iran deal by itself, in the book explained in details, is a transaction. I mean, in popular talk, I would say the Iranian regime fooled us. It's a transaction for which we send $150 billion. It's Iranian money, granted, but it's not the regime's money. This money should be released when there is a change in Iran. Don't send it to the regime that is fighting us. So what they've done with the money, most of it, and again now from 2021 till now, this offshoot or this extension of the previous policy under this administration are doing the same. But are doing it in a stubborn way, relentlessly sending money to Iran's regime. And what they do, everybody knows now. They are purchasing weapons. So what we're going to encounter them, those who are shelling us in Syria and Iraq and maybe in other places in the Middle East, that money, those ammunitions were purchased by the money we send them. I have never seen any case in history that would resemble this. And that brings me to the conclusion that short of a massive change or rechange in foreign policy in Washington, I don't know when it's going to happen. We barely have now a new speaker. It's only 1 year before the next elections. So if we don't have a massive change in foreign policy and national security under this administration, which I don't know if we're going to be able to do it, or the next administration, Iran is winning and their allies are winning, and Israel is going to get more and more strikes like these, and so are going to be Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan, our other allies.
Based on all that you've studied and based on your book, do you leave any room for a hope for America and Israel?
For America, hope is still here. It's a great nation. It has still all the resources that nobody else has. That's in terms of potential, we have them. What we need now is that, as you just said exactly, that the American public, which has instincts at the end of the day, they trust their government to a certain limit, and then they make up their own opinion, and then they have to transfer that opinion to their elected officials. And there is a chance, even this year, there is a chance that the administration, under pressure by Congress, will start changing on all levels. First of all, I can see some signs that this administration realize, or some officials at least realize, what's happening on the southern border. If we lose our border, all foreign policy is irrelevant. So first you have to, it's like immediate emergency medical treatment for the southern border. Second, obviously we have the resources in the Middle East to, first of all, start to partnering, obviously with Israel, there's no question about that, but with the Iranian opposition, with the Lebanese civil society, with the Kurds, with our normal allies, traditional allies in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. We can form again that coalition and isolate the bad guys, should it be the Iran regime or the jihadists. That is possible. But at this point in time, it needs pressure by public opinion on Congress and Congress on the administration. And that's in the interest of the administration. I'm not political at all, but if they want a better chance for next year when people are going to be, comparing notes, they need to do those changes now, because what we see in the region right now will be even worse by next year, and they will become responsible at least morally and politically. So there is a chance. For the Israelis, they have never shied from doing whatever they can to defend themselves. It would be much better if that defense would include the United States, would include the Europeans, and of course the Arab moderates. That will increase their chances of survival.
So take action.
This comes as the Biden administration on Monday set up a plan to fight anti-Semitism on college campuses.
We can't stand by and stand silent in the face of hate.
Cybersecurity experts with Homeland Security are reportedly set to work with schools to combat anti-Semitic content online.
No one should be afraid to walk from their dorm or their dining hall to a classroom.
New York Governor Kathy Hochul on Monday visiting Cornell University. This after anti-Semitic threats were posted on a discussion board related to Cornell. The graphic threats reportedly showed murder, sexual violence, and comparisons to animals.
We will not tolerate threats or hatred or anti-Semitism.
She announced the state will ramp up security on campuses across New York. The FBI and local investigators are now reportedly looking into the threats as well. Meanwhile, students at Columbia University, New York City, rallying against anti-Semitism.
My Jewish sisters and brothers and I are on the receiving end of death threats from our peers.
The students demand the university do more to tackle hatred, hoping that the current rise in anti-Semitism comes to an end. Ariane Pastar, NTD News.